Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I very much hope that this video finds you well and in very good spirits wherever you are in the world. And today, if you don't mind, I would very much like to continue on with our journey, our discussions, our explorations, and our discoveries with respect to a very fascinating and brilliant release of a collection of works from this great filmmaker and artist, Marlon Riggs. Now, the release that I'm speaking of is a Criterion Collection release of a collection of works that was made earlier this year of 2021, and that has been given SPY number 1082. And this release from Criterion is this: The Signifyin Works of Marlon Riggs. And as some of you may know, over the course of a number of videos, it has been my great honor and privilege to be able to speak a little bit about each of the films that is included in this great set, again from this brilliant filmmaker, Marlon Riggs. That brings us today to a work which is described as being from 1995, and it is the final work in the filmography of Marlon Riggs. And also, we should point out, which is a part of the discussion about the life and filmography of Marlon Riggs, which you can find, for example, throughout the supplemental material that can be included with this set. You will know that Marlon Riggs, unfortunately and very sadly, passed away due to complications from AIDS. And he passed away in 1994 before this film could be completed. So he was working very hard to make this film that we will be talking about today. And unfortunately, he passed away. But the film was completed by certain the crew members and the filmmakers who knew him very well and who knew this project very well. And so we have the finished product that we can speak about today, which is part of this set. The set is The Signifyin Works of Marlon Riggs, and the film today, the 1995 film, is Black Is, Black Ain't. So there's a lot already in terms of the significance and weight of the film in terms of how it relates to the life and death of Marlon Riggs. This individual, this human being, this filmmaker, this artist. And also I should say that aspects of his life, and indeed aspects with regard to his death and his struggles in terms of his illness and his need to be hospitalized, and his speaking directly and expressing his thoughts and feelings and concerns and fears and intimate notions about his life and his death as it is being affected by his particular illness. These are all intertwined very powerfully and very bravely into this work, Black Is, Black Ain't. And so, much like many of the other works that we have seen by Marlon Riggs in this particular set, in his filmography, we understand that Black Is, Black Ain't is a work that is very much from the heart. It is a sincere, earnest type of discussion from the heart and soul of Marlon Riggs. So sincere and so earnest and so honest, it could be said, that he is really giving us his all. And so at the point where he is in his most maybe vulnerable in terms of his physical condition, and indeed his perhaps emotional and psychological condition because of the weight of the illness that he is confronting at this particular point in time, the final moments, the final year of his life, he is still determined, and he is still focused, and he is so passionate, very passionate about making this film, Black Is, Black Ain't. And he expresses this passion, and he expresses this importance, this feeling of this artistic weight that he feels in order to reach the conclusion of the completion of this work. This work means so much to him, and he explains this as to why in terms of the principles and in terms of the themes and the discussion points that are embedded, included, combined, a part of the essence of this work, Black is, Black ain't. So there is so much. Not that there wasn't any in his prior works. Of course, there was so much writing in his prior works as well. But this film, Black is, Black ain't, especially when we consider it in the context of Marlon Riggs's career, filmography, and his life, and of course his very tragic and very sad passing, we understand that this film holds so much meaning and significance in a myriad of important ways. Black is, Black ain't, from 1995. And so if we were to talk about the focus or maybe the essential themes or maybe the essential trajectory of this particular work, the hypotheses, or the assertions or arguments that the film makes or seeks to make, I think we can focus on the generally described theme of race and racial identity, and the idea of what it means. It's in the title, Black is, Black ain't. And to borrow a phrase from the film itself, because the film is also about a gathering of interviews and interview excerpts and comments from commentators and also scholars and academics, as well as from people in Marlon Riggs's own life and Marlon Riggs himself, as well as the approach to the medium and the style and the visual style and the sonic style, the sounds and the images that we understand as part of the Marlon Riggs aesthetic of cinema and storytelling and film and the visual medium or the media and audio media that is involved, a very multi-talented and a multifaceted approach to this medium. And so we understand that the question, or one of the key questions, is what does Black mean? What does Black mean? This is one of the questions that's actually posited in the film itself. And with this, we have, I think, the flow of the film trying to ascertain or determine or discuss or to work out the answer to this complex question. It is a complex question, and indeed, therefore, the answer or answers are quite complex indeed. But this is, I think, at the very heart of Marlon Riggs's approach and style. He does not shy away from the complexities of the issue, the various possibilities of such answer to the question. And this is one of the great strengths of Marlon Riggs's visual and audio and indeed cinematic aesthetic, which is that he really goes for the heart and with an honest endeavor to get at the substance of what it is that this question is all about. What does Black mean? And so with this, the film then goes, and I think in a really lovely way, in a well-organized, well-thought-out trajectory, in trying to answer this using, say, a feeling of history, using the metaphor of gumbo. And this is a great way to link this discussion with Marlon's own life, because the idea, the image of cooking gumbo in the kitchen based on his own mother's recipe, the family recipe, this becomes, I think, a really poignant metaphor by which Marlon Riggs and company seek to try to attempt to answer this question, what does Black mean? And this goes into various, say, discussion points. For instance, it goes into a type of etymological type of discussion about the use and the connotations of the word colored and the word black. And so the idea here is that perhaps there were times in prior periods of history where the use of the word black to mean or to suggest or signify race or racial identity aspects it was often regarded to be a negative connotation, or it carried with it a negative connotation. Thus, the reliance in the vernacular for the word colored or other words that would be used instead of the use of the word black. And then we have a lot of people who are being interviewed talking about their personal experiences, about how it was thought when they were growing up or in their family, based on what their parents might have said or people in older generations might have told them, that the use of the word black was derogatory. And herein we have also Marlon Riggs talking about also the possible links as to why a type of externally imposed label on with an externally imposed label, that being the use of the word black, also the associations that could be carried with it in terms of their meanings, their import based on dictionary definitions, how those dictionary definitions might be suggestive of a type of negative connotation with this particular word. However, what Marlon Riggs also does is he also is suggesting that there was a point in time, perhaps coinciding around the midpoint or a little bit beyond that in the 20th century, perhaps coinciding with the civil rights movement in the United States, how there was this notion or concept of the use of the word black and having a sense of pride in such use, because the idea of the concept in terms of etymological viewpoints would not be necessarily as an externally imposed label, but rather a word that could be regarded as being a very sincere and very truthful and very sort of sincere endeavor at expressing this aspect of racial identity. And so the phrase comes about in a lot of the interviews here, being proud of being black, not using the word colored. And in fact, what happens there is that there is a type of switch that could be said to be occurring, in that the word colored therefore might be seen as being the externally imposed label. And instead of using such externally imposed label, which the use thereof would be a signifier of some kind of derogatory meaning or stance, then rather of using that word colored, then the word black should be used as a more appropriate way to describe one's identity. And so this, I think, is a very interesting flow of conversation, because it really goes at the heart of the complexity, I think, of not just representations of race in media. It's not just ways in which identity is expressed, but also it goes at the very heart of communication, language, words. This is a really key point about how this word, or the use of this word, or many words that are the subject of the piece, black is, black ain't, this becomes such a fundamental point. It's so fundamental because language itself, the use of language, the use of words is so fundamental. This is one of the key points of communication between one person and another person. One of the flows, avenues of communication is words, speech. Those words that we use, therefore, have so much meaning. Where does that meaning come from? Is it externally imposed? That is are these words, meanings, labels that are imposed upon us? Or are they generated from within, some kind of internally generated acceptance of a particular concept or idea, thus making it not just acceptable, not just appropriate, but also accurate, and also quite a sense of claiming a power over language, which overcomes any kind of externally imposed senses or meanings of particular words or phrases. This is a really powerful concept. And it becomes so powerful when we realize that this is one of the ways, or this is one of the means, or this is one of the positionings, if you were, in terms of how people view themselves and how people therefore regard themselves and value themselves. If, for instance, there is a word that describes one and one's racial identity, the word black, if this word black has itself inherent negative connotations that are also emphasized or reinforced by external imposition, then if this word is being used to describe oneself, then the viewpoint of oneself, one's psychological view of oneself, one's internalized view of oneself becomes affected by such negative connotation. However, if one has that same word and views that word with not those negative connotations, but with positive connotations, positive reinforcements, or positive reflections of something that is filled with a sense of pride, with a sense of dignity, with a sense of nobility, then that, I think, in turn has the opposite effect in terms of one's own psychological state and point of view vis-a-vis oneself. And so that type of discussion is really important, and it becomes so important, again, black. It's in the title. Black is black AIN. But again, within the context of this discussion, we see the possibilities of complexity and how this can be, this is a really poignant example of the complex nature of race and racial identity. It's not just the idea of external imposed perceptions, although that is a key part. That is one key component. Another key component is how those viewpoints or meanings affect one's own psyche. So this is a really powerful discussion thread that this film engages in. And we also have, therefore, the idea of a type of use of words and language in order to have those themselves be types of statements. But I don't mean, when I say the word statement, I don't mean necessarily political statements per se, but I just mean statements of fundamental truth or humanity. And so this is such an important concept that leads to other similar and related discussions. The idea of what black means, not just in terms of language and communication, but also in terms of an actual, say, description of realities and physical attributes. Now, what does this mean in what Marlon Riggs is trying to discuss here in Black is Black AIN? This goes into a discussion about skin complexion and about light skin and dark skin and various tones of skin color, and how this type of discussion is very important too in the context of race and racial identity in the United States in the 20th century and prior, of course, but here in the context of the 20th century as an example, because what Marlon Riggs and company here are talking about is the idea of light skin complexion and what that means in terms of racial identity and acceptance. I use that in air quotes, acceptance, and the idea of passing. Light skin complexion could lead to the issue of passing as white, and we have seen this type of discussion. It's been had over the course of, I think, sort of historical as well as a sociological discussion, but it's also very much part of the inherent emotional and psychological dynamic of how one views oneself and in the context of race and racial identity. And this becomes even more complex when one considers the sort of issue or the kind of situation when we're dealing with, let's say, racial identity politics or the applications of race and racial identity in real-world situations. How each person or individual feels about the need for acceptance by, say, white communities, or the need to uphold one's own racial identity, perhaps, perhaps in lieu of some kind of acceptance from the other. And so this type of dynamic becomes, I think, really a very complicated and complex one, and each person seems to, and it also depends on one's society, one's situation, one's context of one's life, the economic situation, the class situation, the sort of historical context overall, each affected by very specific conditions of each individual human being's experience. And so, but it's a very complex matter. And so this is also very relevant to the issue of race and racial identity representation and how that affects one's own viewpoint, as well as one's relationship with the externalized world, as it were. So this is also very important too. And then Marlon Riggs and the people that are speaking on camera are talking about how, for instance, there were attempts to, maybe there was a feeling early in the century to want to, say, straighten one's hair. There's a concept that's expressed in this film about curly hair versus straight hair, and how perhaps in order to try to quote-unquote gain acceptance, the idea would be to want to have hair that is straightened rather than curly hair. Whereas perhaps the maybe resisting such idea, and not just resisting that idea, but in fact embracing one's own natural physical attributes, whether it be skin color or whether it be the way in which one's hair grows naturally. This too becomes a really not just symbolic act, but also very powerful and inherently fundamental act of human expression. Right? This is who I am. It's what that seems to be saying. In other words, my hair grows naturally like this, and so this is who I am. And that becomes, in the context of Black is Black AIN, that becomes another aspect of race and racial identity vis-a-vis the outside world and vis-a-vis oneself, right? And I think that becomes that's such a great characteristic of Marlon Riggs's cinema overall, because we think, or we understand based on his past works, Ethnic Notions, Tongues Untied, Color Adjustment, etc., that one of the key concepts of Marlon Riggs' cinema, including Black is Black AIN, is the concept of the inherent importance and the essential fundamental, the fundamental significance of being able to truly express oneself. And that is true in terms of language, that's true in terms of dance and body expression, one's own sexuality, and indeed, in the example cited in Black is Black AIN, that is also true in terms of one's own physical attributes, one's own hair. It grows like this. This is who I am. So this is another aspect, I think, of the importance that Marlon Riggs seems to be placing, or the light that he is shining upon the importance or highlighting the need to express oneself truthfully in these many examples, these many forms that he seems to mention in his films, including this, Black is Black AIN. And so this becomes part of the conversation about expressing oneself and one's attributes, physical and emotional attributes, and one's own characteristics, using traits and terms and phrases and visual images and styles and modes of thought and ideas that aren't affirmations of what others think of oneself, but what rather are, well, let me put it this way. These aren't labels inspired by others, but rather they are affirmations of who we are. That's the key. That's the key. And so this becomes the idea of type of having a sense of being proud, or having a sense of real earnest, honest takes and expressions of one's own humanity. So this is a key fundamental concept of this film, Black is Black AIN, and thus in the filmography of Marlon Riggs overall. This is such an important concept. But then the film goes in, it's already going in some really fascinating avenues, and it also goes into some avenues about the idea of black identity, and how this type of expressions of identity, especially when we get into the mid to the late part of the 20th century, how these have also within themselves certain issues of identity and a type of expression that also, I think, are issues that Marlon Riggs and others, I think, identify very acutely and quite powerfully. So one of the aspects here is the way in which race expression is either in line with or colliding against expressions of sexuality. And when I say sexuality here, I mean in the context of let's say, the example that's given here is how does expressions of black identity in examples of 20th century America, late 20th century America, how does that coincide with expressions of masculinity within the black community at the time? So this is one of the examples that is cited by Marlon, Riggs and Company here, and how this notion of perhaps there was this idea, maybe a public idea or a publicized idea, or a highly, say, reported on concept about how expressions of pride in one's racial identity were somehow or another intertwined, quite directly, in fact, with expressions of sort of a sexualized masculinity. And so what this means is a type of maybe sexual prowess, a type of maybe strength of certain attributes that could be said to be, or perhaps are asserting themselves as being attributes of, or positive attributes of masculinity. And how these are linked in this public way and what the consequences are if indeed that is indeed the case. And so I think what the consequences are, and what the film Black is, Black Ain't is trying to get at as far as one of those consequences is how that affects one's own psyche vis-a-vis concepts that one might have towards masculinity, femininity, sexuality, the concept of sex and gender as well. And so this is, I think, a really fascinating and very complex issue too that this film Black is, Black Ain't is speaking of. And what it goes to is it goes into a number of really interesting avenues. One of the avenues is this idea too of expressions and notions of feminism, and how feminism might be affected either maybe positively, beneficially, or perhaps adversely by these sort of outward shows of masculinity that are linked with expressions of pride and racial identity. And so this connection between these two types of expressions and thought, I think, is one of the issues that Marlon Riggs is identifying. Also the idea too, and I speak of sexuality, there is of course the idea of homosexuality. And Marlon Riggs too, he has featured himself as a black gay man. And here in the film Black is, Black Ain't, this concept of the way in which sexuality is viewed by certain people, even within the black community. Sometimes there is the notion that Marlon Riggs expresses, as well as others express, as they've expressed in this film and others, about how there might not necessarily be acceptance from the outside community because of one's homosexuality, of one's sexuality. And this type of non-acceptance or rejection of acceptance does also come from certain aspects or certain parts of the black community that Marlon Riggs identifies. And so there is a way in which a certain member of a certain church is interviewed here for this film, and how this person seems to be expressing types of attitudes against homosexuality. Now, I'm not suggesting that the fact that this person is being interviewed means that this person is meant to represent the entirety of the church within the community, and I don't think Marlon Riggs is going that far. But the point is that I think this is being cited, or this particular person that's being interviewed in the film is cited as an example of the type of absence of acceptance, or the rejection that is certainly felt, at least from certain parts of the communities. And so this idea of one's sexuality also affecting how one is essentially able to express one's racial identity. This is a key part of Marlon Riggs's films since Ethnic Notions and Tongues Untied, and he examines it further here. And the idea that even within this idea of a black community, and the idea of maybe within the black community there is this notion of unity, and there's this notion of unity leading to racial pride. How even these concepts and notions might be potentially adverse or detrimental to the way in which people, individuals, might want to express themselves in terms of their sexuality, in terms of how they view masculinity or femininity, etc., and gender and the like. And so there is this perhaps uneasy relationship between the concept of unity based on racial pride on the one hand, and expressions of individuality and individual humanity on the other. And in fact, that I think is something that the film Black is Black Ain't points out so astutely. Inherent in the word itself, unity. Unity itself, I think, inherent in its meaning, foregoes the idea of individuality. It foregoes individuality for the sake of unity. And I think but the idea of the benefit of promoting the concept of unity as expressed in this film, Black is Black Ain't, is the idea that the message of unity is very powerful one, especially if one is dealing with a sort of potent climate of racism in the community writ large. And so if one is in that type of environment, then the concept of unity as a type of unified front, as it were, means, I think, a very potentially powerful message. That's one of the arguments, on the one hand, that the film recognizes. But as a counter to that, what this emphasis on unity seems to do, again, one of the points of the film is, it has the potential of drowning out the voices of the individual. And if those voices need to express one's, say, sexuality or one's feelings about gender, etc., then those voices not being heard also have a detrimental impact, consequence overall. So this is, I think, a really powerful spotlight that this film is casting upon this particular issue. And I should say, too, that the film, however, it deals with these very serious issues, but it's also dealing with them in that way that Marlon Riggs also is so skilled at. He has this way of, one of the ways he does this is he is willing to have himself be part of the conversation, not just part of it, but himself be one of the focal points of the film. And so he shows himself, he speaks to us, he speaks to the camera, he shows parts of his family and his own viewpoint and his background, even when he is perhaps at his most vulnerable, as I say, in terms of his physical condition, in terms of his illness, etc. Even where it could be said that he is at his most vulnerable, he still puts himself there and shares with us his feelings and thoughts. And also another way that this film does this, expresses these, makes these discussions, I think, in an effective way, is also, again, as exemplified by Marlon Riggs as others, through humor. There are these passages where humor is used in a very witty way, in a very funny way, and Marlon Riggs himself contributes to this, the way in which there's a particular part where he is expressing certain ideas about music and musical traditions, and we see him singing. We see him singing these different musical traditions from his hospital bed. So it's a very, I think, witty way to, again, express this particular concept, the idea of unity versus individuality, and the idea of the multiple or the multitude of variety of individual voices that exist within the Black community. And he also uses his own personal life and the family, and his own family, and his mother and his grandmother, the gumbo mix, the recipe, how it is a mixture of many different foods and food elements, and how this therefore becomes using part of his life to serve as a metaphor for the discussion points about this concept of the importance of emphasizing individual voices even within a community, right? So So he's using humor, he's using his own life. He also talks, I think, about a very positive message about the idea of love. And family equals love. And the word family, of course, can be defined quite broadly. It can mean familial or blood relationships. It could also mean relationships that extend beyond such blood ties. And so this, therefore, has a broad meaning. And this broad meaning can be taken from various areas of the community. And I mentioned too that there was this way in which a certain member of one particular church was being referred to, but also I should say too that I think the film Black is Black Ain't, as well as other works by Marlon Riggs, such as Non, je ne regrette rien, for instance, we see ways in which the church community also serves as a very positive and very positive influence and an important aspect of a community support. And so this, I think, leads to that, I think, wonderful way in which Marlon Riggs is not trying to give us a type of overall generalization, but he understands that there are various ways and various individualized ways in which some things or some aspects or some points of society or community can have a truly positive impact. So, and this comes again in the context of the idea of what is family and what is community. So this is, I think, a really powerful type of discussion overall, and it's a very complex one, very nuanced one, and I think these are very difficult questions, but Marlon Riggs, as we know, does not shy away from these difficult questions, but rather he engages with them and in a heartfelt and earnest way. I should point out too that this concept of this maybe this uneasy type of relationship that Marlon Riggs seems to be identifying with regard to the idea of unity versus the idea of individual expression. This type of uneasy relationship, or this issue that seems to be identified by this film, is there. And so the question, well, that's the question. So what is the solution? What is the solution that this film perhaps posits as a response to that particular dilemma or issue? And I really like this. It talks about not necessarily focusing in on the concept of unity, but rather focusing in on the concept of communion, the notion of communion, and the idea about how the notion of communion is a type of group dynamic, a type of strength in community, while at the same time preserving or protecting or upholding the individual voices that are being expressed or that need to be expressed. And when we think about that, I think that becomes one of the great living principles of Marlon Riggs's films and his life, this idea of expression of one's own feelings and thoughts, how this is an individual expression, and how individual expression is always important. It's either that or silence, the silence of the self, and how that silence can be quite deadly, both psychologically, emotionally, and perhaps even physically. But rather than stay in the silence, one can express oneself and one's true feelings about one's identity, one's feelings, one's family, one's sexuality, what one is, who we are, who I am. I can express this, and how this act of expression is so important, not just in terms of one's own emotional state and one's own viewpoint of oneself, but also within the context of racial identity in sort of on the macro level, on the community level. And if we think about that, and if we think about how the concept of unity as one way of trying to deal with the notion of racial identity in a society writ large, if we think about that and those consequences, perhaps the alternative to that is the idea of preserving the individual voice while at the same time celebrating racial identity, the idea of the notion of communion. This is very powerful. This is extremely powerful, and what this does is I think it ties in so beautifully and so poetically, not just the concept as it is expressed in this film, Black is Black Ain't, but also the concept as we have seen it expressed throughout the entirety of Marlon Riggs's filmography, all the way from Ethnic Notions and beyond, this idea of needing to express oneself, and how this act of expression is itself a type of revolutionary act, And what does that mean to be a revolutionary act? This idea of change, this idea of some kind of expression of a truth that could lead to change. The change could be, on the grand scheme of things, maybe relatively minor, minuscule, or it could be quite grand and quite impactful on a macro level. But whatever the case may be, a change is still a change. And so this type of active expression, therefore, carries with it so much import, and we find it expressed in Marlon Riggs's filmography all throughout, whether it be on the focus of the people that he is interviewing, the people who are telling us their stories, or the way in which history is spoken about and talked about, how expressions seem to be either told or perhaps withheld, and maybe we see the consequences of such withholding, or we see the consequences of such telling. Or perhaps it's inherent in the films themselves. In other words, the act of these films that Marlon Riggs is making is themselves, or the acts themselves are acts of his own self-expression. And we see that as viewers as examples of that self-expression. And we see the power of the films. We are reminded, or I'm reminded at least, that, my goodness, this is not just a statement about the importance of an expression of this self-identity as a means of recognizing and establishing one's own, say, concepts and ideas about race and racial identity and race representation, but also it is a universal message about expressions of oneself. This is so key. This is incredibly key, and this is, I think, at the heart not just of Marlon Riggs's filmography, not just of his concepts about race and sexuality. It's all there, of course, it's all there, but it's also an expression of Marlon Riggs's own humanity, his humanism. When we see him in action, whether it be featured in this film or in other films or in the supplements, etc., when we hear him speak, we can get the sense immediately. The humanism of Marlon Riggs. This is so key, and the humanism and the message of his humanism, his humanistic message, is at the heart of this discussion. Black is, black ain't. What a powerful statement this is. And the final work of Marlon Riggs, it is a very powerful reminder, and it is very, of course, very poignant and emotional when we consider it again in the context of Marlon Riggs's own life and a very sad and tragic passing. We should point out too here that we will talk a little bit more about Marlon Riggs's filmography and career. Let me say that this is produced and directed by Marlon Riggs, and also co-producer is Nicole Atkinson, and co-director Christiane Badley. And so we understand too that the great efforts of these people and Marlon Riggs's very close-knit groups of filmmakers and crew really helped to finish the film after Marlon Riggs unfortunately and very sadly passed away. And so we have this final film as a type of tribute and celebration to the life, the art, and memory of Marlon Riggs. This is the work, Black is, Black Ain't. Okay, my friends, so that's it for now. And so until we meet again, please be happy and healthy and well, and please keep on watching a lot of great, great movies. Thank you so much, as always, for your time. I very, very much appreciate it. I really, really do. I hope to see you at the next video on the set. We will have one more video talking about the other comments about the supplements of the Signifyin works of Marlon Riggs, this great Criterion set. I hope to see you there, my friends. But in the meantime, cheers.